computer speakers. All participant lines are muted. Note the engagement icons on the left side of your screen. A copy of today's presentation is available in the handout section. To ask a question, enter it in the Q&A.
Welcome to today's webinar titled Money Transmitter License Compliance Explained that's taking place Tuesday, May 9th, 2023. I'm Aisha Stewart and I will be your moderator. Please note, following today's webinar, there will be a few survey questions that I will be sharing with you. In addition, a link to the recording will be sent out in a post-event communication email. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Hans Hawk, Content Management Manager for CT. Welcome, Hans.
Thanks, Aisha, and welcome everyone. Happy Tuesday. I don't know about where you are, but it's super nice, sunny and warm here in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, where I work. Although the pollen is absolutely insane right now, so if you hear my voice get a little scratchy during the presentation, that's why. My name is Hans Haug. Like Aisha said, I've been working in the business legal research field for nearly a decade now, and in my current role at CT Corporation, I provide internal support to the CT Business License Division. Specifically, I help to analyze business regulatory law and maintain our company knowledge base. I also assist in the production of external-facing business compliance content like articles and podcasts and webinars like the one you're all attending right now. As Aisha mentioned, this presentation is called Money Transmitter Business License Compliance Explained. And as the title suggests, we're going to be talking about the regulatory landscape that money transmitters and related business types have to navigate, with a specific focus on licensing and registration at the federal and state level. Real quick, I wanted to thank my colleague and team member, Kobe Ringenberg, for providing some research assistance for this presentation. A lot of what we'll talk about later on has to do with upcoming legislation and what's down the road for money transmitter regulation. And Kobe was key in breaking down that legislation. So thanks, Kobe. She's in attendance as well to maybe help answer some questions at the end. One last note, like Aisha said, again, please stick around to the very end and let us know how you liked the presentation, whether you found it to be helpful, etc. You know, any feedback is super helpful. So thank you in advance for that. Okay, let's move on to our agenda for today. So here's our agenda for today. First, we're going to touch on the very basics. So what is a money transmitter and what does a money transmitter business do? How it's defined and what sorts of businesses fall into the category of money transmitter. Then we'll move right into the ways in which the federal government regulates money transmitters operating in the United States. So what sorts of registration requirements there are and how to comply with them. Then we'll talk about licensing at the state level, which makes up the bulk of the regulatory landscape for money transmitters. So we'll talk about how states regulate money transmitters, what it takes in order to be qualified to obtain a license, and some other maybe unexpected prerequisites to licensure. Next, we'll zero in on actually obtaining a license as a money transmitter. So we'll talk about the application process at the state level, what that looks like, what sort of documentation and supporting materials a prospective money transmitter might need to gather and submit as a part of applying for licensure. Then we'll tackle ongoing compliance. So once a business is licensed and compliant at the federal and state level, what does it need to do to remain compliant going forward? So we'll talk about renewals, periodic reports, that sort of thing. And finally, we'll look ahead at what might be on the horizon for money transmitter business regulation. So what are some trends we're seeing with regard to laws and what might be the next phase of regulation for these types of businesses? I'll also mention that I'll try to leave a minute or two for questions at the end, but if we do run out of time, which does happen sometimes, or if I don't get to your question specifically, I'll definitely follow up in the next day or two via email to respond to any unanswered questions. So ask away. So with all that nailed down, we can jump right into it, and we'll go ahead and move on to federal regulation. Now, before we go into definitions, which you'll see a big long one up there, I want to make it clear that at the federal level at least, we're really going to be concerned with two terms: money transmitter, which is largely what this presentation is concerned about, and money services business, which is an overarching sort of umbrella term essentially defined as a person or business engaged in, among other things, money transmitter activity. And if you've studied a lot of business law or a lot of law in general, you see that sort of couched definition structure a lot, right? Like, what's the definition of an architect? Well, it's someone who provides architectural services, okay? I guess that helps me, but what are architectural services? That's the more important question. And so while the main federal regulations are placed upon money services businesses, what they're really talking about and what we're really talking about is money transmitters and a handful of other business types that we'll touch on briefly. For our purposes, though, the money transmitter definition is the one we'll need to analyze when examining the regulations placed upon the industry. So just to restate the main point from all that, the federal government regulates money services businesses, which is a category of business of which money transmitters are one type among several. So what is a money transmitter exactly? The name, it does a pretty good job of explaining itself, but the federal definition is up there on the slide. So to summarize briefly, the U.S. federal government defines a money transmitter as essentially any person who engages as a business in accepting currency or funds and transmits the currency or funds, or the value of the currency or funds by any means through a financial agency or institution, Federal Reserve Bank, or electronic funds transfer network. Basically, and then at the end there, or basically any other person engaged as a business in the transfer of funds. So they really covered all their bases there. But for practical purposes, what types of businesses are we talking about exactly? Well, one stat to note is that since 2015, the number of money transmitters operating nationally, that means in all states, has more than doubled. And that's largely because of the growth of one type of business, e-wallet services, like Venmo and Cash App, PayPal, and those sorts of mobile app businesses. Also, financial services applications like Robinhood that allow you to trade stocks and store funds via your mobile device can be considered money transmitters, although we'll talk about whether or not those in particular might actually be exempt from the definition in a little while. And applications that deal with cryptocurrency as well, right? So the federal definition you see there makes room for not only the transfer of currency and funds, like I said, but also the transfer of the value of currency or funds, which is broader and helps to eliminate the uncertainty that might otherwise exist with regard to crypto. So then down at the bottom there, you'll see some other business types that might fit the bill of money transmitters. And you'll note that when states are regulating money transmitters, they might be calling them something else entirely, or fitting them into a definition of one of these more traditional or old school type of money services businesses like check cashers or currency exchangers, et cetera. So for instance, issuers of checks or money orders or traveler's checks, even postal services, can sometimes be lumped in with money transmitters for purposes of state licensing and regulation, right? A state might have one license to fit all those business types. And so it's just something to be aware of. While your business might be a money transmitter service, the actual license you need to obtain might be called a check casher license. But again, that's at the state level, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, so let's stick with the federal level for the moment. But moving on, let's move on to the next topic here. Let's actually get into federal regulation. We've gone over the definition. Assuming your business meets that definition of a money transmitter, or more correctly at this level, a money services business, the federal government requires a registration as such with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or it's FinCEN for short. And you'll see up there the usual suspects of business types that are required to register as money services businesses. Now, this money service business registration is in essence an anti-money laundering initiative. It was designed to help the government keep track of the various entities that might be transmitting funds in order to curb and prevent criminals from laundering money, illegal trade funds trafficking, and even in extreme circumstances to prevent terrorists from having unfettered access to funds. And what the FinCEN MSB, that's Money Service Business Registration, consists of is an online registration application that it collects basic facts about your business and the businesses or clients with whom you partner or serve. You'll have to disclose the states in which you're doing business, the specific types of activity you're engaging in, and information about the banking institutions or accounts that you utilize or transmit through, if applicable. Now, there are some exemptions to registration requirements, the most obvious exemption being banks. So banks are, all day long they're transmitting monies, right? But banks aren't required to register as money transmitters. They're already extremely regulated in their own regard. Same goes for stock traders and persons registered with the SEC or futures traders. These are typically exempted from the money transmitter definition and thus the requirement to register. Another bit of wiggle room is that generally the law allows you to move around monies for clients as a business without registering as a money transmitter, as long as you partner with someone who is licensed and registered as a money transmitter, or if you do so on a, quote, infrequent basis and not as a standalone service for an obvious business gain or profit. Subsequent rulings have also exempted creators and developers of money transmitter software or applications, as long as they themselves aren't engaging in the ongoing business of money transmission. Also, businesses that operate exclusively as payment facilitators can sometimes qualify for an exemption. And a payment facilitator, it's basically a person or a business who acts as a payment processor to facilitate the purchase of a good or service or through some sort of payment system by agreement with the creditor or seller. And that last part is sort of the fulcrum. So if you're operating by contract with a specific creditor or seller, you might be able to qualify for an exemption to registration. So there are some exemptions, but if you do meet the definition and you're not exempted, then you have to register. And also you have to submit periodic logs of your transmissions and reports of suspicious activity or large cash payments that your business has facilitated. So, registering the business is the first step, but really it's ongoing. You have to maintain and submit the appropriate logs and reports, and that's how you remain in continuing compliance with the federal MSB registration law. By the way, registration and all of the required reports are submitted through an online portal. It's called the BSA e-filing system. For the reports specifically, usually you upload like an Excel spreadsheet to the e-filing system on a periodic basis, or in the case of suspicious activity, you upload as needed. And lastly, I figured I'd mention that Canada, down there at the bottom, has its own version of federal money services business registration, with a lot of very similar definitions, exemptions, and reporting requirements. So if you're liable for registration in the US and you're operating and serving clients in Canada, chances are you're going to need to register there as well. Okay, let's move on to the state level. That's where we really get into the meat of regulation. Okay, so you'll note on this map that nearly every state regulates money transmitters with some form of license, with the only exception being Montana, which at the time of this presentation does not have a license requirement. And it's interesting because Montana is very aware and recognizes that they are the only state not to regulate money transmitters. And on their website, they note that they receive tons of questions each year from money transmitter companies, just making sure that no license is required. They do ask that if you're a business in this realm and you aren't sure if your activity is regulated, that you submit a business description to their Banking and Financial Institutions Division so they can verify that none of your activity does fall under regulation. But generally, if you're only engaging in money transmission services, no license is required in Montana, so you're scot-free there. As for the other states, though, some form of license is required in each of them, and that includes DC. And for nearly all of them, a license is required regardless of the type of presence you actually have within the state. So let's get into it a bit, and we'll move right into how to get licensed at the state level. So most states have some version of a legislative directive stating no person shall act as a money transmitter without. And that is followed by having procured a license from such and such division, or registering with the Board of Financial Institutions, or a number of other endings to that clause there. But if you'll remember, some states don't call their money transmitter license a money transmitter license. Delaware and Wisconsin, for instance, call it a check seller license. Iowa calls it a money service license. But nevertheless, in nearly every state, money transmitter business activity falls under the scope of practice requiring some form of license. And so we need to identify it and obtain it if we're a money transmitter business. Honestly, the worst part of Montana not requiring a money transmitter license is that I have to say nearly every state instead of being able to just say every state every time. Anyway, state money transmitter licenses are typically an annual or sometimes biennial license, meaning you need to renew it after 2 years, or 1 if it's an annual. And there are some initial prerequisites that a business must meet in order to be considered for a license. One of the most common is a financial net worth requirement. So a lot of states will require a business to have a net worth of anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000. And a couple of states, I think Utah is one of them, require a net worth of $1 million in order to become licensed. And this can be the biggest dissuading factor for a lot of brand new businesses seeking to enter the realm. Another common prerequisite is background checks for owners and key officers, and sometimes credit reports for these individuals are required as well. Many states have certain staff requirements, most commonly a compliance officer requirement. So a business must show that it has a compliance officer on staff who is sufficiently trained, educated, or experienced to be able to provide compliance assurances on behalf of the company. And to go along with that, often businesses are going to need to show that they have processes in place to ensure compliance with state laws and protect consumers. So there can be a lot of business structuring and planning that needs to happen before you can just go out and apply for a license. Certain states like California require that you meet with regulatory representatives in person or virtually before they'll even consider your application. And it's funny, I'm on a first name basis with some of those California regulators because literally anytime I call or email them to ask about some nuance of license law, they ask me if the business I'm representing has scheduled their pre-application consultation yet. So I have to say, yes, they will. And I say, is it still with Jonathan and Laura? And they say, yes, it's still with Jonathan and Laura. But yeah, they're pretty strict and particular about it. And then I did want to note that there can be some extra difficulty for international or foreign-owned entities seeking money transmitter licensure in the United States. And that's for a couple of reasons. For one, international background checks and credit checks can be much more cumbersome and time-intensive than standard U.S. background checks and credit checks. And some states draw super hard lines regarding the citizenship of the owners or officers of money transmitter businesses. Nevada, for instance, states that all officers of a money transmitter business must be a U.S. citizen or hold a U.S. work visa. Otherwise, licensure will not be granted. So just ironclad. Most states, though, require that the compliance officer be a U.S. citizen at least, or that compliance officer at least be located in the U.S., and only a handful will allow the compliance officer to be a third party. Most require them to be a direct employee of the money transmitter business. So again, not saying it isn't possible for foreign businesses to become licensed, and businesses have found some creative ways to skirt some of these requirements, but it's definitely more cumbersome for foreign-owned money transmitter businesses on the road to licensure in all 49 states plus DC. Okay, let's move on a little more to the actual application process. And so this is a look at the actual application process. There we go. And just an obvious caveat here, it's going to look slightly different for each state. So I'm essentially going over commonalities that exist across the board, but not everything I say is true for every single state. There are a lot of overlapping, but a lot of not overlapping as well. First thing to know is that the vast majority of states issue money transmitter licenses via a third-party web system called the Nationwide Multi-State Licensing System, or NMLS. And we're going to want to go back one slide. NMLS began operating in 2008 as a central repository, specifically handling mortgage licensing, because states were finding it difficult to comply with changing regulations associated with the federal passage of the SAFE Act, which, among other things, prescribes stricter mortgage licensing measures following the housing and financial collapse in 2008. So NMLS took on a lot of regulatory functionality so that states could all get on board with the SAFE Act as quickly as possible, but that's mortgage. NMLS now handles a slew of license types for states, but they're most concerned with the financial services realm. So they'll often handle consumer finance company or lender licenses, credit service organizations, and of course mortgage brokers and originators still, and businesses in that arena. But they're adding new types of licenses periodically, and states seem to be pretty happy to utilize them because the benefit of using NMLS for the states is that they have a nice uniform platform where applications can be submitted, supporting documentation can be gathered, and supplemental reports like background checks can be initiated. And so this takes a lot of administrative work off the plate of the states. And as compliance experts, we love NMLS because it very clearly lays out what's needed and expected during the money transmitter license application process, what documentation is needed, who needs to sign what, etc. So again, we mentioned the prerequisites for licensure on the last slide, and during the application process, you'll need to show proof that you meet those prerequisites. So you'll typically need to show documentation that you meet the financial net worth requirements. This usually takes the form of a recent financial statement prepared by a CPA, like a certified accountant, showing that the business is financially stable and above the net worth threshold set by the state. And one of the questions I get a lot in my day-to-day is what exactly counts towards your net worth? As a small startup, I might not have $500,000 cash on hand. Do these assets need to be liquid, or can they be a combination of a lot of different investments and loans? And I've heard different answers from different states. But general accounting principles are usually pretty clear that a business's net worth is the difference between its assets and liabilities, regardless of liquidity, with a few exceptions. But I bring this up just to make the point that a lot of startups might form a money transmitter business without knowing exactly what the financial requirements are to get licensed to operate legally. And so a lot of times they never get off the ground in the first place. If you don't have the net worth to satisfy the prerequisite, you won't be able to get licensed, essentially. Now, the net worth requirement can sometimes be accompanied by a credit check requirement or a requirement that you submit letters of credit for individuals in positions of control. And that usually means officers and owners and any other high-ranking individuals in your company. And you might be required to provide account statements for business or personal accounts associated with the applicant business as well. And if there are any major delinquencies, bankruptcies, etc., you'll be asked to provide all of the details for those as a part of the application process. Now, you'll almost always be asked to provide business formation documents, copies of your state bylaws, and any compliance or consumer protection policies like we mentioned earlier, copies of other state registrations if required. For instance, a lot of states require that you register with their Secretary of State as a foreign business entity before you can apply for licensure. This is called foreign qualification. So you'll need to show proof of that as well. Then again, we have background checks for owners and key officers. This can often involve getting fingerprinted at your local sheriff's office, or at the very least, giving your consent to undergo a national check and then waiting for those results to come in. You may also be asked to provide proof of experience for certain key officers. Like we talked about the compliance officer earlier, you may need to show that they have some education or experience in the financial or legal realm, whether that's the provision of transcripts, certifications, letters of reference, or what have you. And then, of course, there are the application fees. And depending on the state, these can range from $500 up to $5,000, not including other fees like fees per branch location, if you'll have a physical office, fees for getting fingerprinted or background checks, and fees to obtain your financial statements and those other documents we mentioned just now. So you can imagine that if you're trying to break into the money transmitter industry and want to provide services in all states, just simply applying for the appropriate licenses can add up to a lot of time and money very quickly. Now, NMLS does help you cut down on at least the time aspect, maybe not so much the money aspect, by providing what is called a multi-state application process for money services businesses, wherein they're actually going to collect and apply your supporting documentation across the board for states with relatively similar licensing processes, so that you'll only have to provide, say, one background check, one set of financials, one set of business formation documents, etc., to knock out the requirements for a good, I think it's 20 to 30 states at this point. that are involved in the multi-state application, assuming you want to apply to all of them at once, rather than having to provide these documents individually to each state. So that's one more reason we're glad to have the NMLS system. That said, though, each state still has its own processing time to review your application. So best case scenario, you've submitted everything correctly and no additional documentation is needed. States can still take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, even up to a year in some cases, to process your application and ultimately issue your license. It all depends on the completeness of your application and, frankly, the backlog and capacity at the state board in question at the time that you submit your application. Okay, moving on. So let's say you've satisfied the prerequisites, paid your fees, submitted all your supporting documentation, and been approved for a license in the states in which you plan to do business. Well, your compliance obligations aren't exactly over. There are ongoing requirements that money transmitter businesses need to satisfy, and you can see some of them on this slide. So at the federal level, you've registered as a money services business, but you'll need to renew that registration. This basically means submitting a registration renewal form online and making sure that all the information that you reported during your initial registration is still accurate and hasn't changed. And like I mentioned before, there are also reporting requirements at the federal level. Again, reports of transactions, suspicious activity reports. And these are reports that the federal government expects a money transmitter business to submit either regularly or as the situation dictates. And if they find out that you have neglected to register or make the appropriate reports, they will levy penalties, which usually involve civil money penalties. And then at the state level, there's your license renewal, of course, which can occur, like I said, annually or biennially. And it also involves submitting a renewal application with a renewal fee. Again, verifying that the business information is still accurate as reported and that you haven't moved into any new jurisdictions or begun engaging in a new activity, things like that. And one thing to note about state license renewals, they don't all have the same renewal date. So some may expire every June 30th. Some may expire biennially at the end of the year on odd years only. Some may expire annually from the exact date that they were originally issued. And states might warn you about an upcoming renewal, but they certainly aren't required to, and a lot of them don't. So it's super important to keep track of license renewal dates for your entire license portfolio. Have a system in place so that you can begin your renewal applications early, so that you can submit them on time to avoid interruptions in your business, late fees, license revocation, and other nasty sorts of penalties. And then always be aware that states are going to require you to report any major changes to your business as they occur. So not only during renewal time. So if a principal officer leaves the company, for instance, and is replaced by someone else, that may be something that a lot of states are going to require that you report within 30 days of it occurring. Same goes for changes to your business name, entity type, ownership, physical or mailing address, literally anything. And when you have licenses across multiple states, this can sort of get to be a cumbersome endeavor, to update each appropriate board with the new information. So just be aware of that. Again, have a system in place for reporting changes in a timely manner so that you can remain compliant with the state regulatory boards. And it's not even shown on this slide, but it's just good business 101. Be aware of non-money transmitter licenses and registrations that you'll need to get as well. So I'm talking about sales tax if your business begins to sell something tangible, state payroll taxes if you have an employee working in a state, even local basic business licenses. It's been sort of a hot topic around business licensing lately, but a lot of major cities are now requiring businesses to obtain a city business license if they have an employee living within their borders and working from home. So, as your business changes and evolves, just make sure that your license and tax registration liabilities are all being met. And then lastly, up there, you're expected to keep an eye on new or changing legislation that affects your business type, whether federally or at the state level. And with money transmitter, laws will sometimes change without warning, especially with the continuing evolution of cryptocurrency and e-wallet applications. There are some aspects of the industry that can be considered new legal frontiers. So it's always a good idea to keep your ear to the ground for legislation that might be coming so that you can be sure you remain compliant with whatever the law says. Okay, moving on again. And that's a good segue, actually. It's the perfect segue into our next topic, which is looking ahead. So what's on the horizon for money transmitter legislation? And I'll start by just answering that question very simply, a lot. There's a lot of change on the horizon. And the biggest reason is that states are right now in the process of implementing changes to their money transmitter laws due to the passage of a federal act called the Money Transmitter Modernization Act. It's sometimes known as the Money Transmitter Model Law. And this was passed back in 2021, and it basically seeks to modernize and make uniform the regulations that are placed on money transmitters by prescribing a model law that states can choose to adopt for themselves. So like we said, the term money transmitter used to mean a seller of checks or a currency exchanger, but now it can mean e-wallets, trading applications, and lots of other techie solutions that transmit funds. And so this group, called the Conference of State Bank Supervisors, recognized the need for new and uniform regulations in this industry. Thus, the Money Transmitter Modernization Act was conceived and passed. Now, it's not a mandate. States still have the agency to adopt or reject the law. Excuse me. And in fact, in 2004, another Uniformity Act was passed called the Uniform Money Services Act, but only a handful of states ultimately adopted that one. But at this time, it does appear that a larger amount of states are in the process of adopting this new Money Transmitter Modernization Act. Now, when this act was passed, like I said, back in 2021, a lot of states were already largely in sync with the prescribed model. So they were doing background checks for owners, they had appropriate net worth requirements, what have you. But others maybe didn't, or maybe the regulations they had weren't sufficient or strict enough, or their legal definitions didn't fit the modern landscape well enough. And so as we speak, states are introducing and passing bills to bring their money transmitter regulatory structure into alignment with the federal Money Transmitter Modernization Act. And so what exactly does that look like? Well, like I just mentioned, a lot of it deals with the now federal requirement that money transmitters, well, not requirement, again, federal strongly prescribed model that money transmitters have a threshold net worth of $100,000 or a prescribed percentage of their total assets before becoming licensed. So states that didn't have that requirement on the books are adding it now. Part of the prescribed model includes the requirement for money transmitters to submit audited financial statements for each fiscal year. That was new for some states. Some of it deals with the nuances of letters of credit that businesses have to obtain and present as part of the license application process. And a lot of it also deals with virtual currency. So states are now bringing their laws up to date by defining what virtual currency is and where it fits into their money transmitter legislation. There are also some parts of the model law that would effectively ease regulations depending on the law that states previously had on the books. Like Arizona, for instance, used to require that for any transaction greater than $1,000, the money transmitter had to collect information such as occupation, signature, and taxpayer ID for all parties involved. The new law does not have that requirement, and thus the adoption of the law, which Arizona has indeed adopted it, eliminates that requirement. So again, it's not always a tightening of regulation, but it is a change. So that's Arizona, but a few more specific examples. Bills were just passed in the past two legislative quarters, so Q1 2023 and Q4 2022 in Arkansas, Georgia, Hawaii, Indiana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and West Virginia, either adopting the Money Transmitter Modernization Act wholesale or adopting specific sections from the act to incorporate within their own regulations. Some of these have been signed and enacted and carry effective dates. Some are still awaiting a signature. And there are at least a dozen states in which related legislation has been introduced or is currently moving through the state houses. So that makes something like 25 states currently changing their legislation in some way, or at least are on the route to. It's moving through their state houses. And these laws are doing just what we just talked about. They're revising money transmitter definitions, they're adding exemptions, net worth requirements, specifying letter of credit requirements, surety bond requirements in some cases, and just generally bringing their state's laws into the 21st century with regard to money transmitters. Certain states like New York have even created specific license types separate from the money transmitter license type to deal with businesses engaging in virtual currency exclusively. And that's kind of interesting. New York did that on its own back in 2015, though. So it's not really a response to this act, but they have a separate license specific toward virtual currency. But for states that have been loosely or insufficiently regulating money transmitters, these can represent major changes for licensed businesses who now may need to show increased proof of net worth or obtain background checks where they previously did not have to. And so you can go to sites like csbs.org, which is the website of the Conference of State Bank Supervisors, which is, again, it's the group that approved that law. Or you can use state bill tracking services to search and view all of this legislation as it passes through state houses of Congress. And you should, if you're a money transmitter business, because chances are the legislation that you're in compliance with now will not be the same in 6 months or a year. The good news is when states ultimately do adopt the regulations prescribed in the Money Transmitter Modernization Act, assuming a good, healthy majority of states do, compliance is going to be a lot more uniform and easier for businesses. So I would expect, for instance, to see the NMLS multi-state application process eventually include all states. I would expect that state prerequisites would be more uniform and thus easier to comply with. And just generally, compliance will be more streamlined and easy to understand. And of course, with modern language being added to state laws, consumers are better protected from, strange new tech services offering to handle their money. So we're in a transition and implementation phase at the moment, but ultimately the legal landscape is going to be a lot more navigable down the road, at least until the next odd industry wrinkle inevitably manifests. Okay, let's move on from legislation on the horizon here. All right, time for a quick shameless plug. And because the money transmitter industry is such a complex industry with variations in licensing requirements from state to state, like we've discussed, we've developed an off-the-shelf research report called BL Regulatory Insights Money Transmitter. Basically, it's a 50-state plus DC and federal compliance report that details licensing requirements for each state, as well as how to apply for licensure in each state. So, we've included things like net worth prerequisites for each state, which states require background checks and credit checks, and whether the state requires foreign qualification before it's going to accept your license application, things like that. We've also provided links to applications, disclosure of application fees, and even references to statutory code showing you what each state considers a money transmitter business to be. So if you're a new business or an established business that wants to review money transmitter requirements across the U.S., this will save you a ton of research time. It is a premium subscription-based report, so again, this is a shameless plug, but we do think the peace of mind and the time it saves is well worth it. So check it out. There's going to be a post-webinar email that goes out when you're done here that will have a link where you can learn more about this report. So again, I'm pretty proud of the work we did on it, and there you have it. All right, that in essence will conclude the presentation today. Looks like I have time to answer a couple of questions. Let me see if there are any outstanding here. Is there somewhere I can view all states and whether they're adopting new laws for money transmitters? Okay, so if you're talking about Money Transmitter Modernization Act specifically, yes, because it was conceived and approved by the Conference of State Bank Supervisors. They themselves keep a pretty up-to-date record on their website, so you can go there. That website again is csbs.org. Now, if you're talking about all laws affecting money transmitters, as time goes by, there really isn't one central database that I've found. Different states are going to pass different things at different times, and so you'll be best served by using a state bill tracking service. So there are websites that offer state bill searches. There are some subscription-based ones like StateNet is one we sometimes use. It's run by LexisNexis. BillTrack 50 is a good one. and there are some free ones out there as well. But basically what you have to do is you have to search by subject. So you can search, money transmitter and see any sort of recent laws that states have passed related to the industry. Obviously, you have to do that every so often so you can stay current. We usually do it about once per calendar quarter or so. Or another shameless plug, you can partner with a compliance partner like CT Corporation, who will make sure you're always up to date. Let's see, what else do we have? How does New York's BIT license program fit into the money transmitter model law? So yeah, as I said a bit earlier, New York back in 2015 established its own crypto licensing law, and it was called BIT license. So that's what this question's asking. Basically what it did was it created a license type specifically related to storage and transmission of cryptocurrency or virtual currency. And they call it a virtual currency business license. I believe it's a $5,000 application fee. It's like a credit report requirement. It's pretty similar to the other money transmitter licenses. But where does it fit in? I think basically it's not likely to change or be affected by the Money Transmitter Modernization Act. Like I said, they just passed it in 2015. I don't anticipate they're going to change it anytime soon. It's just one more little wrinkle that you'll need to navigate if you're planning on operating as a money transmitter in all states. Okay, I do want to leave some time for everyone to answer the poll questions here at the end, but I appreciate everybody's attention and you're signing up for this webinar. I appreciate everyone's time, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar. And I'll go ahead and hand it back to Aisha for the poll questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Hans. Before we conclude, I would like to share a few survey questions that we have. The first is, would you like to be contacted by one of CT's business license experts? Again, that is, would you like to be contacted by one of CT's business license experts? I'll give everyone a few more seconds. Okay, moving on to the second question. Please rate the value of today's webinar content on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Again, that is, please rate the value of today's webinar content on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. And moving on to our last question. Please rate today's presenter on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Again, that is, please rate today's presenter on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Thank you for attending. This does conclude today's webinar. Have a great day.